a lot of you guys have been asking me about this. The question being, ebony for a bridge. I have my reasons. What are yours?
Well, curiously, the very first guitar I made, 1966, I used ebony for the bridge because one of the books I was working out of said, use ebony for the bridge. So I said, okay. The sound of the first guitar was not impressive. Obviously, I kept at it. And in fact, I've kept at it for the last 60 years.
And how many have you built?
830.
Oh, that's it?
Something. I don't know. Anyway, the thing I've observed with ebony for bridges is it's a much heavier wood than rosewood. Typically, the ebony we use with musical instruments is so dense that if you put it in water, it actually sinks. It does not float. It's denser than water. Most rosewoods will kind of bob to the surface, but they will float. So it's too dense of a wood. And while it does have a kind of a very solid ring tone to it, it doesn't have that xylophone key-like ring that rosewoods have. Now, many other woods have been used for bridges, but traditionally either Brazilian rosewood or Indian rosewood are the two woods of choice. And that's what I use for 99% of the guitars I make.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, when I pick up a piece of ebony and you ring it, one of the things that we can hear is that really, really high pitch.
Yes.
But there's nothing else to support it. And it's actually really quiet. So, when I'm looking for a bridge, or sides or back, is I'm not only looking for that high ringtone, but also I'm looking for the color of the ringtone. We choose our wood differently. I listen to the ringtone and the color and the character and nuance of the wood. And when I'm building a guitar, I try to match that character to that guitar, or to be opposite of that guitar if I'm trying to do something different. What are you looking for when you kind of ring a piece of ebony or another piece of bridge wood?
So when I listen to a piece of wood and I listen to the ringtone, I listen to the whole envelope of sound that it gives. And ebony is a very solid, high-pitched funk, but it doesn't have that kind of sustaining singing tone that I look for. Brazilian rosewood has that, and Madagascar rosewood has it. Curiously, the Indian rosewood doesn't seem to have it as much, but yet in the finished instruments...
I think they make really great bridges.
Well, the Indian's a little lighter weight typically than Brazilian is. Like many Hausers were made with Indian rosewood bridges, even though the sides and the backs may have been Brazilian, although he did use Brazilian also. There's a lot of overlap with these different rosewoods, but I think all in all, they're all much superior to using a piece of ebony, and even the Macassar ebony, which some makers use, which is another type of ebony.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to point out that, when we make bridges, it's a very mechanized process for us, where we have a whole bunch of steps that we go through, and we'll make up something like 100, 150, 200 bridge blanks at a time.
For our own instruments.
For our own instruments.
Yes, not when we're copying someone else's model.
Those are one-offs.
Yes.
But when we're making our own model, we'll make 150 or so at a time, because that's just the size of the piece of wood, and we try to maximize and utilize every last bit of it. And in reality, the vast majority of the time it takes to make that bridge, at least to do the way we do it, is in the setup of the machines, not in the actual running of the machines. One of the things that I find really interesting is that when we tap our Indian rosewood bridges, which are generally from one, maybe two planks, there is a vast difference in sound, even on the same piece of wood.
Yeah, they do vary, and you can kind of like drop them on a hard surface like our table saw table, which is cast iron. And you can hear that ringiness as they kind of on the table.
You can hear I call it the dance of the bridge. Where you drop it and some will go plink, and there's no resonance.
Right.
And I'll generally pass those off into his pile. And then there's
like
others,
I don't notice.
Right. I've noticed that a couple have come back. And then there's others that will seem like they dance for days.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see, maybe that was how it was oriented in the tree versus the way that we cut it or something. But it's a very interesting thing to, where I guess what I'm trying to say is we can't blanket statement to say Indian rosewood, good. Brazilian rosewood, good. Ebony, bad.
Yeah.
But I think that as a whole, we tend, and we've seen a lot of guitars through the years, we tend to find that the ebony guitars, or at least the ones with the bridges, tend to have a duller response. We've had a couple guitars where the bridges are absolutely obliterated from like a 12 hole, and we've replaced the bridge where we make an exact copy, except that we said, hey, you know what? Let's not use ebony for this.
Yes. Yes.
Let's do a Indian rosewood.
Yes.
Because basically the problem came about because of that brittleness of ebony, which we haven't even talked about. And I think that the guitar was a far better guitar after the after the fact.
Yeah. Well, one thing, as a violinist, you'll appreciate this. You know how you mute the sound of a violin, right?
Yeah, you put an ebony wedge onto the bridge.
It's a weight.
It's a weight.
It's a weight. And if you take any of our bridges or a copy of any famous maker's bridge, make two versions, one in ebony and one in one of the rosewoods, and then put them on a scale and weigh them, you will find that ebony bridge always is heavier.
Oh, yeah.
It's a small amount, but when we're working at the nth degree of refinement, that small amount becomes a big amount when you're talking about sound output.
Right. I mean, when we weigh our bridges, and we don't weigh every single bridge, we kind of have a general sense of it. You know, I know that our bridges tend to weigh somewhere around 16 and a half and 17 grams.
Correct.
But when we did this, we weighed it with that jeweler scale, and there was a significant amount of weight differential. And like, we're talking like almost 2 grams.
Right.
And percentage-wise, that's a massive amount.
It is. Percentage-wise, that's a huge amount. You're exactly right. And so you've got all that extra weight that's really doing nothing beyond the function of the bridge and its inherent design. And I might add that the design of that bridge is really important. It's the single biggest brace on the top.
It is.
And you want to capture a maker's sound. Let's say you want to make a copy of a Hauser or Fleta, Garcia, Simplicio, whatever. Doesn't
One
matter.
of yours, one of mine.
One of mine. The first thing you've got to start with is the bridge. You've got to get the bridge right. If you don't get that right, the rest of it could be as perfect as possible, but you'll not get that maker sound because the bridge won't be right.
Yeah, I've seen so many times online where somebody says, I want to make this guitar. I don't know how to make the bridge. I bought one off of Stu Mac or, LMI or,
And
Guitar
boom,
Port Store.
Sounds like the generic factory bridge.
They say,
it is.
You see them later on in the forums, oh, those plans are garbage. I built those plans and it sounded terrible.
Right.
Well, maybe it's because you didn't use the right bridge.
Yeah. The bridge is very, very, very important. It's the interface between the vibrations of the strings and the soundboard, which is the entry to the guitar box.
So let's now think about the sides and the back.
Yes.
Because we've talked primarily about the bridge. But I think a lot of this applies to both of them, like the sides and the back as well.
Yes.
Right? So, you end up with a heavier guitar. And I'd say that even from a player's perspective, their first impression of the guitar is not necessarily looking at it, but it's when they pick it up. And there's two things that I know that we both focus on is what does it feel like in your hands? What does it feel like when you pick it up? And then how does that tuner feel? And we can't do a whole lot with the tuners other than making sure that they're well fit.
Right.
But when you pick up an ebony guitar, you are picking up an ebony guitar.
That's right, because the extra weight is there, and when you have that extra weight, of course, the sides and the back, everything on the guitar vibrates, so it has to get in motion, right?
Right.
You got that extra mass there.
Yeah.
And what happens is you get what I call the Regis Philbin sound effect. It goes like that. It takes a while to get there.
For those of you who don't know who Regis Philbin is, you're on the app. Go check it out. You'll find him. And you'll turn down your headphones because, volume warning.
The weight of that ebony and its kind of reluctance to really want to vibrate all contributes to that kind of reticence of the guitar, which is why I don't use it for sides and back for sure. Yeah. And I've really not used it for bridges after that first guitar. I realized, that wasn't a help.
Okay, so let's go into that weird hypothetical realm.
Okay.
What if somebody came to you and said, I absolutely want this guitar made out of ebony, but I also want it to sound good like your guitars do? What would you do?
I'd suggest we pick rosewood, really.
but that's getting outside of the hypothetical.
But you could, but what you would have to do is reduce that weight of the ebony down to where you're in the range of a decent rosewood.
Right.
You have to make some compensation also with the bracing,
Right.
and some of the other body dimensions. Take all of that into account. The problem with doing that is you reduce the ebony down. Of course, as the wood becomes thinner, it becomes more quick to react to different relative humidity situations.
Because that's the cube of the difference.
That's right.
It's the cube of the increase or cube root of the decrease.
That's right. By doing that, you end up with a guitar that now is going to have, it may have the sound that you wanted, but you're going to have to be so vigilant about controlling the humidity.
So that's how you would go about it.
Well, there's a lot of other things. I didn't get into the weeds here, but...
Oh, that's all right. Okay, so for me, if somebody said, I have to have an ebony guitar, first I would really try to strongly push them towards like a Malaysian or African blackwood, which are lighter...
Yes.
You know,
There's other woods that kind of look like ebony, but aren't.
Right. Although I do find that they kind of have the same acoustical problems, but not to the same extent.
Cadillac's, the Mexican wood, would be a good.
Yes,
that's a good choice.
You've made a couple.
I did. I've made some out, and I'm familiar with it. It gives a very nice, bright clarity and singing quality.
But at the same time, it's a little bit maybe too red chocolatey color.
I've got some that would pass as ebony. The 11-string Taurus that I restored, that had a Cadillac's fingerboard on it.
That's right. Yeah, that was a beastly hard.
Yeah, number second element, number 71.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
1884.
Would you ever consider maybe doing like a double back, like maybe almost like a veneer, but find another material that's ever so slightly less dense? That way you average the two together.
You could do that, but that also runs into the problem of the difference of expansion contraction rate between the two woods that are glued together.
Well, you know, if we change the lamination direction slightly instead of going like a full 90 degrees.
I would do them both in roughly the same orientation.
Maybe no more than about 10 or 15 degrees off. Yeah.
But the physics says that the two different woods are going to have two different rates of expansion contraction with the same humidity differential conditions. So whenever you have that, you run the risk of that becoming a problem also.
Right.
But as long people are more careful about humidity today than they used to be, so that would be a good option.
I really do think that the advent and usage of those Diodario or Boveda humidity packs are really one of those things that we're not seeing what you would call stupid cracks in our shop so much anymore.
Yeah.
I remember, way back before those made big waves, so to speak, we would have just tons of crack repairs, and we had some that I could count on as my Christmas bonus because they were previously glued with synthetic glue. And every year they would pop right around the same time, and I'd go back in there with, the proper glue and say, hey, you really need to watch this. And they go, oh, I'll deal with it next year. And then finally, I haven't seen them for a while, and I saw them. They're like, hey, I started using these things, and now my guitar hasn't cracked.
There you go.
And it's only the guitars that I saw that were previously fixed with Type Bond that were having these reoccurring problems because you can't glue to it.
Yeah. So those have really taken away a lot of crack repairs that would have been, I think.
Right. But on the plus side, and I will call it a plus side, it's saving a lot of guitars from prematurely removal of service.
Yeah, true.
As I always like to say, the guitar lover in me says yay, the repairman in me says boo. With the usage of ebony, I think that, there's, at least in my opinion, there's only two places that it really should be used on a guitar.
Bindings and fingerboards?
No, let's call it three.
Okay.
Headstock.
Headstock. Yeah, that's okay for headstock. Yeah.
I think it looks nice and it polishes up. It has those really beautiful glow to it.
Particularly if your client wants a carved headstock.
Yes.
Because it's so dense and so compact, you can do a very detailed relief carving into that and get tremendous detail, and it will hold forever.
As you so aptly showed on the cover of Scott Tennant's Pumping Nylon, which is one of your 25th anniversary models, which has that ultra intricate head carving, which is a word I can't say apparently.
Yes.
With all the beautiful stippling and carving. I mean, it's incredible. And
ebony's the ideal wood for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally, yes.
And it's absolutely stunning and gorgeous.
But mainly the fingerboards, yeah. There's a reason why it's been the traditional choice of material for fingerboards, because it wears.
Yep.
And in the case of guitars, when they're properly fitted, it's the ideal media to hold those frets for efficient transmission of the sound to the bridge rather than dissipating the sound at the fret.
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of people say that they like rock maple for the fretboards, and actually, if you look at the Jenka scale, the rock maple is actually really soft in gross comparison to the ebony.
It is, yes.
You know, and then I know a lot of people say that they like the sound of rosewood, and I think that there's a musical choice to be made if you choose rosewood fingerboards over an ebony fingerboard, and you know, you can hear a difference. It tends to be a gentler, sweeter guitar, I think.
Very true, and that's held up by the observation of the old boys. And many of those older Spanish instruments, even when they were a very deluxe instrument, were often fitted with a rosewood fretboard rather than an ebony fretboard. And I don't think it's because they couldn't get ebony.
No.
I think it's a conscious choice on the makers to select the rosewood for exactly the reason you stated, which is to soften the sound and give it a more feminine quality to its character.
Yeah, I think so. Because, I mean, it's not like these... So if you say that they didn't know what they were doing in choosing the ebony fingerboard, that's basically saying that Santos didn't know what he was doing, Torres didn't know what he was doing, Vicente Arias didn't know what he was doing, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
You know, we're talking about a whole bunch of guys who, you know, we still use as reference to this day as some of the greatest. And I don't think that it's even a matter of economics for some of these guitars either, because some of these guitars would have cost a year's salary or more.
They were very expensive because the wood was so expensive in relation to the final price.
Right, and we see on some of these guitars where they will use ebony somewhere on it, just not for the fingerboard. And I have to agree. I think it's definitely for that musical.
Yeah.
I agree with me. It's for that musical component, which, you know, it's definitely a choice. And maybe if you like that rock maple, there's a musical choice for that to be said, more so than the hardness. It's dense, but it's not as hard as you think.
As a material, it's as resistive as anything to the acidic erosion of skin oils, which is going to happen when you have fingers in constant contact with the strings and the fretboard and the frets.
Right.
And that's what where the most of the wear occurs, is through that acidic erosion of the surfaces. And as the skin oils penetrate into the ebony, there's also a degradation of the ebony, which causes it to become chippy. And that process can actually be accelerated if one says, well, I think I'll smear lemon oil all over because somebody said use lemon oil.
Right.
So that's why we don't recommend that.
Right. And you know, we kind of made this observation with some of these instruments that, you know, we do a lot of refrets. I think this week is 4 or 5 for me. I've lost count at this point.
Yeah.
And we find that the guitars where, you know, somebody says, oh, by the way, yes, I use lemon oil on, we have found a very, very high correlation, like almost 100% correlation between them saying they use that and the fingerboards being exceptionally chippy to work on.
Yeah.
Now, I know a lot of people say, but the fingerboards look dry. How do we get oil into it? It's like, well, okay, first of all, if your fingerboard looks dry, that's fine. Oil doesn't hydrate. Oil
it's not
is
water.
Oil.
Yes, it's not going to replace the moisture content nor the dimensional aspects of the fingerboard. Only humidity control can do that.
What you're doing is you're saying it's not shiny.
Yes.
So wash your hands. It'll be fine.
If you want the maximum sustain and singing quality, that's the wood we want to use.
Yeah, for the fingerboard.
For the fingerboard.
For the back and sides, I'd choose something else, something that looks good.
Yeah.
So with that said, please keep commenting. Tell me what you like, what you don't like. And if you like an ebony guitar, tell me why I'm wrong and why he's wrong.
I'm all ears.
Huh? All right, I'll see you next time. Thank you.